G'day, my name's Alex Bainbridge. Welcome to the Green Left Show. Today we're talking about Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado. Probably most people in Australia hadn't even heard of her before yesterday's announcement about the Nobel Peace Prize. But the media has been reporting her as a champion of democracy, as a campaigner for peace, and as basically a legitimate and deserving winner of this Nobel Peace Prize. In actual fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Before we get underway, I do want to acknowledge that we are recording this episode of the Green F Show on stolen First Nations country. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and we pay our respects to our elders and warriors past and present. Also, if you like the work that we do, please do become a Green Left supporter if you're not already. It is the number one way that you can support our work and we can keep the wheels turning. It's also the number one way to receive the content that we produce. There's details on the Green Left website or in the description of this video or podcast, wherever you're getting this episode of the Green Left Show. Now, today I'm here with Federico Fuentes. He's a long-time Latin America solidarity activist. He was based in Caracas for a number of years, reporting for Green Left about the ongoing developments in the Bolivarian Revolution. And he's also a published author in Latin America's Turbulent Transitions, and he's a member of Socialist Alliance. He's a great person to talk to us today about this topic. Now, I began by asking Fred, please just introduce Maria Corina Machado to people that haven't heard of her before. Tell us what she's like.
Certainly. Maria Corina Machado has a long history as an opposition activist in Venezuela. One that goes all the way back, in fact, to at least we can talk about the 2002 coup attempt against then Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. Whilst at that time, Machado herself was perhaps not a leading figure of that coup attempt, she was certainly one of the signatories to what is referred to as the Carmona Decree, which was a decree signed by the interim president at that time, which dissolved all democratic institutions in Venezuela as part of that coup plot. Now, ultimately, that coup plot failed. But ever since then, Machado has continued to wage her campaign, first against Chavez, and then following Chavez's death against current president Nicolas Maduro. During that time, she's made a very concerted effort to present herself as a democracy activist. In fact, she set up a non-government organization, Sumate, that was dedicated itself to electoral transparency. She was one of the key figures involved in the recall referendum. That was so the collection of signatures for a recall referendum to try to remove Chavez in 2004. Whilst they were successful in having a recall referendum, ultimately the majority of Venezuelan people voted to keep Chavez as their president. But that did allow her to establish a lot of relationships, I suppose, with what you could define as perhaps more liberal sectors, in the NGO world, be able to present herself in that way. However, it's also reality, and even more so in the last few years, that Machado has increasingly come to be the head of the more extreme anti-democratic sections of the right-wing opposition in Venezuela. Her actions have included supporting quite clearly violent protests aimed at unconstitutionally removing President Maduro in 2014 and again in 2017. She's led a lot of calls for abstentions in elections, and famously in the previous presidential elections, so not the ones just last year, but the ones held before that. First was part of a campaign to call for abstaining on that election campaign, and then to basically to support a fake parallel government that was set up by the then opposition head of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, and that was used to kind of try to create a parallel government that was never a reality inside Venezuela, but was certainly used internationally as a way to sort of further the sanctions and the isolation of Venezuela internationally. So quite clearly, her politics have been far from supporting democracy. What is interesting, I think, also is to note is that it is in the last presidential elections where you see these two sides of her politics come together. Because, as I said, even though she was quite committed to being a part of the extreme right of the opposition, she changed her political tactic in the 2024 presidential elections and actually opted to run in the opposition primaries, which she quite clearly won. in those primaries, but was then banned from being able to run as a candidate. And so subsequently, the opposition came behind Mundo Gonzalez. But she ran a campaign and supported Mundo Gonzalez on a very extreme right platform, the kind of platform sort of quite often now put forward by new right political formations around the world. And that's why it's no surprise that following those disputed elections, much of the places where she sought support was from the Patriots of Europe, sort of organisations that involve things like Italian President Meloni, seeking out support from Le Pen's party in France, and of course seeking out support from Trump, and in particular he's what has become commonly known in the US as the Magazuela supporters, a combination of MAGA and Venezuelan exiles or migrants currently live in the US. So I think we've undoubted even more so today. I think, particularly after this Nobel Peace Prize, if we have to sum up Machado, we have to view her as both quite clearly a politician who's on the far right, extreme far right, the anti-democratic far right of politics, but that also today is also the main opposition or the main opposition figure to the Maduro government.
So when they were announcing the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, the committee was described her as, quote, a committed champion of peace, and also as someone who, quote, keeps the fire of democracy burning. Do you think these are fair descriptions for Maria Corina Machado? And what do you think these descriptions actually say about the Nobel Peace Prize Committee itself?
Yeah, look, I mean, the Nobel Peace Prize itself, it's one of those funny things because every couple of years they come out with some of the most bizarre choices for people who you think, how on earth could they be identified with peace? Going all the way back to Henry Kissinger to even more recently Barack Obama. Who was picked at a time when he was the person responsible for the most deportations of any US president in history. So. But then everyone then gets surprised once again when they come up with another shocking thing. So I think there's two things to say. The first, very specifically about their description for why Machado should win this, quite clearly are false. I mean, in terms of democracy, as I pointed out, this is someone who supported a coup, who signed a decree to disband all democratic institutions in a country, who supported violent protests that are quite clearly sought to overturn democratic elections. And look, whatever one might say about the state of democracy today in Venezuela, what is absolutely the case is that Machado has been one of the biggest contributions to the undermining of democracy in Venezuela. One can't understand the state of democracy or the lack of democracy in Venezuela today without understanding the very direct role that she has played in continuously undermining the democratic rules of the game. So I think in that regards, 0 out of 10 for Machado, and the same applies for the idea that she's someone that's been campaigning for peace. And we really only have to look at the most recent developments in the Caribbean, where Machado has been one of the most outspoken supporters of Trump's military deployment in the Caribbean, supporting what can only be described as the extrajudicial murder, extrajudicial execution of people who we have no idea what they were doing on those boats. But now 4 or 5 boats that the Trump administration has claimed that they've, as they say it, blown out of the water. On the accusation that they were supposedly carrying drugs, although we will never know because no evidence was collected, no attempt to capture these people were made. They were just simply, as I said, executed. She's proudly said that this is great and more of that is needed, and called for even greater intervention in the name of what she calls regime change, which I think can only really be understood as an endorsement for military invasion and war against Venezuela. So again, 0 out of 10 in terms of the idea that Machado has anything to do with someone who's committed to championing peace. I think more broadly, in terms of the Nobel Peace Prize, and what it says is that I don't think it's let's say just a pure coincidence that they've picked Machado as a candidate in this time. The Nobel Peace Prize has been for quite a while now a very political prize, one where the committee very clearly thinks about how it can intervene into politics at a sort of at a local level and at a global level. I think that's very much behind why they've gone for Machado in this current context, where we had a whole bunch of issues floating around the Nobel Peace Prize and world politics, everything from, and both of them have been interrelated, particularly the idea of whether Trump should get the Peace Prize, and then related to that, Trump's military deployment in the region, and very much with Venezuela in the main eyesight of that, or the main target of that military sort of deployment.
Obviously, it's no secret that Donald Trump wanted the Nobel Peace Prize for himself. and made a big fuss about it publicly. And apparently, the reports are that he was fuming that he didn't get it. There's probably a lot of liberal-minded people that are quite relieved, actually, that Donald Trump didn't win the prize. The US Democrats, for example, put out a meme which was basically saying that not only did Trump not win it, but it was won by a Latina woman, which would be an even bigger rebuke to Trump. I'm wondering what you would say about this line of argument.
Yeah, look, I think I think that sort of line of argument is dead wrong, and it's dead wrong for a number of reasons. And I would also add actually that the other argument actually that I've seen, it's probably not as sort of as prominent in the media, but certainly prominent on social media, and coming of course from people who also oppose Trump. But almost kind of saying, well, in fact, somehow Trump would be even more worthy than Machado of being of having achieved this Peace Prize. If they were going to give it to either of the two, then probably Trump would have been better. I think this misses the point. I think it misses what's actually occurring first in general politics today, and particularly in the region, and then it also then misses what the Nobel Peace Prize is seeking to do. So, on the one hand, I don't think this is just can be simply put down to as a de facto. We didn't want to look bad by giving the prize to Trump, so we're just giving it to Machado as a kind of as an easy way out of dealing with the question of Trump, who's a controversial figure. I think the Nobel Peace Prize is making a deliberate intervention into politics in a context where actually for the last 6 to 9 months, the US government, while maintaining its opposition, its very strong opposition to the Venezuelan government, has not been the most outspoken sort of fans of Machado and the opposition in Venezuela. In fact, if we compare it to, as I mentioned previously, the parallel government with Juan Guaido, he was, often meeting in the White House. Well, back then it was with Biden, but also attending inaugurations. And this time around, what the U.S. government has declared as the president-elect, the person they believe won the last elections, Edmundo Gonzalez, and behind him, Maria Corina Machado, have hardly been mentioned by Trump. Subsequent to the Nobel Prize, of course, they have been mentioned, and I think a sign of the fact that even Machado notices that this is a political issue. She made a point of ringing Trump to say, "Look, I'm handing this in honor of you," because I think she no doubt realized that Trump wouldn't have been happy the fact that he lost to anyone, but the fact that he lost to her would have only increased those divisions. But they weren't invited to his inauguration, and very much unlike previous U.S. administrations, the Trump administration has openly opened negotiations and dialogue with the Maduro government. As I said, in the context of continuing to call the Maduro president as a legitimate president, but have, for the first time met publicly in Caracas in the presidential palace, which, whatever you want to use the words about legitimate or illegitimate, certainly lends some credibility to the idea that the Maduro is at least the president of the country and the one that has to be negotiated with. I think what the Nobel Peace Prize here is doing is really what it's trying to push, is to say, look, we don't really, we don't agree with this authoritarian world outlook that Trump stands for. And here we have a figure that we can present to the world as a democratic activist who, even though has, as I said, very similar politics and is increasingly aligning themselves with that far right, isn't viewed by that as many people. So that's why it doesn't surprise me that many people have come out saying how great it is that a Latin American woman has won this, because what do they know? They know Venezuela is bad, Maduro is bad, and he's someone who's campaigning for democracy. It's probably not unfair to then people to say, well, that isn't that a good thing? Why shouldn't we celebrate that? Particularly if the other option was Trump. What I would say in response to that is that clearly, as I said, Machado's politics are very much aligned with the far right. And what we are seeing here is the Peace Prize and others reminding Trump that actually any solution to the Venezuelan crisis and any solution to what happens in any kind of transition that occurs in Venezuela must involve Machado. Whereas it's not clear from the Trump administration's policy towards Venezuela that is their outlook. That might be their preferred option, but that is not being how they've been operating until now, where they've involved a whole bunch of measures, including, as I've said, direct negotiations with the Maduro government to get what they've wanted, everything from restarting and increasing deportations of Venezuelan migrants back to Venezuela, through to incredible oil deals that are far worse than anything that even previous governments previous to Chavez had signed with US governments, including the recent opening of the new renewal of the license with Chevron. But also we see with the military deployment that's occurring now, a real attempt to see can this military pressure create some kind of rupture within the Maduro government, within the military, that might allow for some kind of let's call it a Madurismo without Maduro, kind of solution out of it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the internal politics of Venezuela, which is a complicated situation today. But I think, as I've said, it is become extremely complicated and made all the more worse by the actions of people like Machado.
You did mention that there have been some US military attacks on Venezuelan boats in recent times, and obviously this Peace Prize announcement comes at a time when there actually is the real risk of a escalation to a more serious war in the region. I'm wondering if you could talk about what your assessment is about the risks of this spiraling into a more serious war. Also, has Maria Camino Machado actually, well, in fact, you did say she hasn't really spoken out. She's been supportive of this US military attacks. What would you say about that? And I guess more specifically, what attitude do you think progressive-minded people in Australia should be taking to this US military aggression on the people of Venezuela?
Yeah, well, starting with the last question first, I mean, the attitude progressive people should, or any person really should take to this, is to absolutely stand opposed to everything that's occurred in the Caribbean today. And what we are seeing there is a grave danger on all sorts of levels, not just in terms of potential military assaults, because there we're only talking in potentialities. But as I said, we've already seen what the US government is trying to do, which is establish its direct and open right to carry out executions anywhere it sees fit. And without any recall to any kind of, not even just international laws, its own laws. It hasn't even been abiding by its own protocols into how to deal with this. I think that's part of Trump's broader sort of international sort of framework. That for all the criticisms and the huge failures there are of the so-called international rules-based order, Trump's approach has just been to just take a wrecking ball to all of that and just say, well, yeah, the solution to that is no rules except might is right. And so this is what we're seeing with this military deployment, and this is what we're seeing with the bombing of the small boats in the Caribbean, and now the open threats that the Trump administration has made of saying that they're going to carry out similar attacks on land. So I think, what are the risks? I think they're very high. In fact, I feel every day that we get closer and closer. I think not yet. I don't think there are any indications yet of a full-scale invasion, and we can get back to that later as to why I don't think that's quite on the cards just yet. But I think that there's an extremely high probability now that there will be some targeted attacks on land, and I think that's because the Trump administration is talking this up so much that it seems unlikely that they can't actually do at least one of those to at least justify the rhetoric that it's doing. How does this peace prize fit into it? This is where it becomes complicated because it's not like, let's say, not everyone's cards are on the table in terms of what exactly they're trying to get out of this. As I've said, the Trump administration has had maybe not a contradictory, maybe a two-track approach to the Maduro government. On the one hand, talk of maximum pressure, of isolation, and on the other hand, being able to negotiate behind the back to get what it wants. Now, is all of this really just to amping up the pressure to 99, with the hope that they can get even more out of Maduro? Or is this a final decision by the Trump administration that Maduro is weak enough that a couple of attacks on land will be enough to sort of to divide the military and lead to some internal ruptures? We don't know. We also don't know what the Maduro government is willing to do. On the one hand, again, Maduro government is been publicly vowing to open up, guerrilla war to the death, to stop any invasion. And yet we hear, we read in the New York Times that basically the Maduro government has been offering up, even more ridiculous deals to the US to basically hand over future resources to the US government, not just oil but gold and minerals, in an attempt to stave off the intervention and to stop China and Russia from being able to get its investment into those resources. So this is what doesn't make it complicated. But where does a Nobel Peace Prize fit into it? I think there's two possible dynamics or two factors that we need to consider here. I think, firstly, it certainly lends a bit more legitimacy to Trump's sort of overall sort of campaign against Venezuela. So that's where it's dangerous. I think that's it. I think Trump yet hasn't been able to make the case for military intervention in Venezuela. I think at home in the US, the opinion polls still indicate that not many, I don't think a lot of people are convinced of the idea of going to war, particularly from a president who says he's a president who ends wars, not starts them. And that's why he's really tried to ramp up this idea of, the war on drugs, the war on, on the terrorist narco cartels, sort of bringing these two things together: war on terrorism, war on drugs. Can we create a sort of a pretext there? I don't think that's worked, but now we've got an added element into that, which is, he is the hero of the Nobel Peace Prize, the fighter for human rights and democracy, who's now speaking on behalf of the Venezuelan people. So that's one aspect to it. But the other aspect to it is, as I said, is now it introduces Machado as a figure that has to be involved in any future negotiations. So all those negotiations that up until now have been happening directly between Maduro and the Trump administration now get complicated, because how does Machado fit into them now? And is certainly, I don't think Trump administration is going to have any issue involving Machado in those negotiations. But what about Maduro? How are they going to be able to react to a figure they've, quite rightly denounced as, extremist, as far right, going as far as saying fascist, all these kind of terms. Now, all of a sudden, are they going to turn around and involve them, Machado, in these negotiations that have been taking place? It's really hard to tell. But because it's so hard to tell, it's because it's such at a high level of probability of, as I said, military strikes on land. I think that absolutely in all this, we have to say that this Nobel Peace Prize has only contributed to making the situation more dangerous, because it's further removed it out of the hands of the Venezuelan people to decide what should happen to their country. And it's made it further dangerous because, as I said, it's given perhaps another veneer to Trump's current military buildup that he may want to use now to sort of to win public support for any future attack.
Thank you, Fred, for your time today. That brings us to the end of this episode of the Green Left Show. Thank you for joining us today. Please remember, as I said at the beginning, if you're not yet a supporter of Green Left, it is the number one way that you can support our work. But even without spending a single cent, you can help us out by giving this video or podcast a thumbs up, give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast Reviews. You can share this with a friend, help us build the audience for the Green Left Show. And either way, we will see you next time.